Hello, and welcome back to the Dialexicon podcast, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary issues at an easy to understand and digestible level. My name is Saurish and Dr, and I'm your host. This week, we're joined by Dr. William Cochran, who is a Postdoctoral Fellow in Embedded Ethics at Harvard University in Cambridge. Hi, Professor Cochran. How are you today?
Hi, Saurish. It's very nice to meet you, and glad to be on your podcast. I've seen a few of your podcasts that you've done in the past, and it looks like you're really doing something interesting here. So I'm glad to be a part of it.
Thank you. And thank you for your time today. Before we begin our discussion, I wanted to ask you kind of an intro question, but how did you get into philosophy and what stood out to you?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I guess I got kind of captured by philosophy in some ways. I remember very distinctly being in grade 8. And my English teacher took us outside one day. It was a beautiful day in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And he just took us for a walk. And we were walking around the neighborhood around our school. And he would just ask us very simple seeming questions that really sort of turned my mind inside out. He would ask us things like, we'd walk up to a stop sign and he would say, okay, so here's this red octagon with these letters on it. Why does everybody stop there? Now, what is it about this that makes everybody behave in a certain way? And, it's a fairly simple question, but it took something that was like so familiar to me that I was sort of habituated into thinking like, oh, you see a stop sign, you stop, and made it unfamiliar in some ways. And that was just kind of like intoxicating. It captured me. And I remember being very wanting to have that feeling more. And so similar sorts of situations happened to me in theory of knowledge class. I took an IB program, and we talked about like arguments about the nature of gravity. And I remember one reading we did was like arguing that we couldn't really prove that gravity existed or something like that. And I remember thinking that as I was leaving class, I might float away because this argument had been so powerful. And so, yeah, I mean, it was things like that that really got me interested in philosophy. But I suppose I didn't really know that it was philosophy that I was doing until much later when I got into university. And I really liked the ability to talk about all sorts of different issues. I didn't really have to concentrate on any one particular thing. I could talk about epistemology or ethics or the history of philosophy or the philosophy of biology, the philosophy of psychology, the philosophy of whatever. It had a lot of breadth, but also simultaneously a lot of depth too. Like you could get to some of the most fundamental questions in each of those disciplines. And so that was very satisfying to me personally.
So when you joined, or I guess like learned that there's like philosophy in college as a formal, I guess, career or option, is that like the first path that you went through? Or like, did you have any other interests that you explored first and then led into philosophy, or what was that like?
Yeah, so I took a kind of roundabout route to get to philosophy. When I started at university, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I took a foundation year program. It's like a great books course for my whole first year. We studied everything from the Epic of Gilgamesh all the way up to Dylan and everything in between. And that was great because I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I just studied everything. And it was from there that I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do after that. So I went to a different university. And I just allowed myself the freedom to take the courses that were interesting to me. And it turned out that the courses that were the most interesting to me were things like Chinese philosophy or a political theory class that talked primarily about Plato's Republic. And so when I left that university, came back to my institution that I started at, University of King's College in Nova Scotia, I thought, what I really want to do is study classics because of Plato. And then I got into philosophy through my studies of ancient philosophy in particular. It wasn't until grad school that I officially enrolled in a philosophy PhD program, still studying ancient philosophy, but I got exposed to more contemporary philosophy there as well.
Interesting. Yeah. And that kind of leads us into our discussion today, which is about Aristotle and Aristotelian education and ethics in computer science. So many students have heard of Aristotle, whether that be through books or I guess like just in general teaching in general knowledge overall, and how he's one of like the greatest ancient Greek philosophers. But I don't think a lot of us really understand the significance and importance of his work. Could you provide some background knowledge on Aristotle and his work in philosophy and his impact?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's in some ways kind of hard to overstate the impact that Aristotle's had. He is in some ways sort of one of the foundational thinkers, at least for the West. So much so that, when we talk about different disciplines in the university, like or like a math department versus a psychology department versus an English department, that division of these different subjects into their own fields, that in some ways you can attribute to Aristotle, something that basic. He was one of the first to really do that. So his teacher was Plato, who wrote dialogues. And in those dialogues, he often talks about how Socrates would interact with various interlocutors, ask them questions, and expose their ignorance about things. And in those dialogues, Plato's often mixing things like metaphysics and epistemology and ethics all together in one very interesting, very engaging conversation. But it was Aristotle, Plato's student, who first tried to sort of distinguish those different fields and systematize them. So that's one of his contributions, is just the sort of systematic approach to different disciplines or branches of knowledge. And then within some of those branches of knowledge too, he was in some ways the inventor of some of them. People often call him the father of logic, which we use every time we're thinking. We're using logic in some respect. Also, he is credited with a lot of the foundational work in marine biology. He spent some time just sort of going off and studying a lake in Assos, I think, and just looking at different marine life and trying to categorize things and figure out what's what in the natural world. He was one of the first philosophers to do that. And, he spent 20 years studying with Plato at Plato's Academy. And so I think he soaked up a lot of what his teacher was talking about there. But then he also tried to distinguish himself in some ways too. And some of the ideas that Aristotle came up with, sometimes in conversation with Plato, sometimes on his own, are still with us today. So things like virtue ethics, this idea that what we ought to be aiming at in life is the cultivation of an excellent character. This is an idea that started with Plato, but was really developed and fleshed out by Aristotle. And it's something that the philosophers still talk about and engage with and try to reinvigorate today.
So that's actually a good point. Like, how exactly, well, I don't really want to make this discussion too much about virtue ethics, because that is an entire podcast episode itself. But I guess understanding how philosophy can really take such a simple concept and expand it over many centuries and like time, like how exactly does that work, right? Because work from Aristotle's kind of research is still being expanded today, especially like virtue ethics is a great example of that, how there's so many kind of new research in that field in general, or like at least exploration in that field. So how does that take place? Is it just like define a theory and then expand that theory into different concepts, different spaces, etc.? Or is there like any redefining of virtue ethics over a period of time? What does that look like?
That's a great question. I think it's kind of like a conversation that happens over the centuries, especially with people as ancient as Plato and Aristotle and some other ideas. So for a long time, Aristotle's ideas about, for example, the motions of the heavens were sort of the received wisdom for the day, and that was just transmitted and passed down. And you didn't really try to innovate on what Aristotle said. You just tried to receive it and understand it and keep it going. But then, for example, with somebody like Copernicus, who sort of turns that model on its head and shows that we actually have a heliocentric universe, that's where you get this kind of counterpoint to something that Aristotle was saying, right? And so that can also be part of the conversation, like negating something that Aristotle or Plato had thought to be the truth, and changing what they had to say. Other times it was something like with virtue or virtue ethics. This was a theory that held sway for a while, but then sort of fell out of favor for many centuries. And it was only in the mid 20th century with Anscombe that there was a resurgence in interest in Aristotle's theory. And so there was kind of a recovering of what Aristotle had thought. And then philosophers would engage with that, like they would critique some of what Aristotle had to say about about different parts of virtue ethics, or people would expand on what he said in some other areas. And so right now we have a kind of flourishing of looking at different philosophical traditions for their conceptions of virtue and bringing them into the conversation with Aristotle. So there's really all sorts of different ways in which you can engage with him. You can disagree with him, you can expand what he had to say, you can bring other people into conversation with what Aristotle's saying, or you can try to recover some of what he said and move it forward.
Interesting. That's like really cool, and like how like philosophy kind of spreads out over time and expands itself almost, right? And I want to kind of like question almost now of Aristotle's notion in teaching. And your dissertation is titled Aristotle's Notion of Teaching and its Role in His Theory of Moral Education. In that, what is your interpretation of Aristotle's notion of teaching? Because again, as I just mentioned, a lot of people might understand Aristotle through his virtue ethics work, which I think is often the most cited or most attributed to Aristotle. But like even for me, when I was researching, like I did not know that Aristotle had a theory of moral education. So what exactly is that interpretation?
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. So insofar as I'm engaging in this conversation about Aristotle that's taking place across centuries, what I'm really trying to do in my dissertation is recover and reconstruct some of what Aristotle says about teaching. So in his works, which are, these two big books worth of writing there, Aristotle mentions teaching, maybe about 50 times. And so not a lot, but the sort of scattered, pieces, the sort of fragments of what he's saying, I think can be combined and put together in such a way that we can develop, if not a theory of what teaching is for Aristotle, at least some sort of notion of how he's using this concept. And so what I argue is that for Aristotle, teaching is a very particular method of education, which has as its goal the installation of what he calls episteme, or scientific knowledge, right? And so scientific knowledge, it's another one of these big terms in Aristotle, but I consider it to be something like having a sort of really robust understanding of some subject, where you can explain why certain facts within a science or within a discipline are the way they are. And that explanation is rooted ultimately in some sort of subject-specific foundational, like first principles. So, for example, in psychology, at least for Aristotle, you'd be able to explain why certain beings move in the ways that they do, and that explanation would be grounded ultimately in some sort of definition of that being's soul, right? That's this thing that is like foundational to the discipline. You would understand what that is and be able to tie that to explanations of all sorts of other things that fall within that science. And so when Aristotle's teaching somebody, or when you talk about Aristotelian teaching, it's really this effort using a bunch of different methods that are grounded in his logic, things like induction, deduction, argument by analogy, that are all really trying to get a student to understand that systematic structure of some discipline. So that's what I take Aristotle to be doing with teaching. Now, insofar as that's connected to his theory of moral education, that's where things get, I think, personally more interesting, where you have a sort of field of study, like how to live well or ethics. And what does it mean to like teach somebody how to live well using this notion of teaching? I argue that there's a sort of two-stage theory to how this works. One is you have learners go through a process of moral education, which is largely irrational. There isn't much of an explanation as to why you want to behave a certain way. You're just asked to do it. And this is akin roughly to what people call Aristotle's method of habituation, getting somebody to repeat some sort of action multiple times until it becomes second nature. And then once you have gone through enough of that kind of habituation process, you've had enough experience in life, then you're ready, then you have the sort of requisite prior knowledge to be taught about why certain things are done the way that they're done, or why you should behave in certain ways. And the ultimate first principle of that sort of teaching process is going to be something like Aristotle's conception of human flourishing, or what it is to actually live a good life for him, which is what you see spelled out in the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics.
So I guess in that scenario, from what you just told me, like in this concept of habituation, it seems that almost you teach the student to do, and then you teach the student why. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would be a little bit nitpicky though, and say you train the student to do something in a certain way. You get
Right.
them to behave in certain ways, but the teaching itself, I think Aristotle reserves that particular term for the intellectual kind of explanation of why they do that sort of thing that way.
Okay, so basically skills like, for example, I don't know, like making something that wouldn't be teaching, that would be like training someone to do, like, for example, let's say you're making a basket, that creation of a basket would be training. But if there is some sort of knowledge that's behind like what materials to use, etc., like why we're using it in a specific way, that would be education.
That would be
Okay.
teaching. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, so yeah, that would be teaching. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So in that scenario, why is it necessary that the student has, or like I guess why is habituation in general necessary for a student to learn or to be taught something?
Well, in some domains it's necessary, but in not all of them. So Aristotle talks about how in mathematics, there's no real experience necessary. You can just sort of start doing math even at a young age. You don't necessarily have to have like the kind of lived experience to undergo that teaching in that discipline. But in something like life, uh, or even in some other areas too, I'm sure, you need to have some sort of familiarity with like basic concepts in order to see how they fit together within a kind of explanatory structure. So if I were to mention something to you like, generosity, if you were super young and you had no experience with somebody being kind or generous with you, you probably wouldn't know what I'm talking about. And so an explanation which referenced a term like generosity would have no meaning. It would be empty. So he thinks that you need to have some kind of experience for the explanation to kind of latch onto and then tie together with other concepts in an explanatory structure.
Okay, I guess that makes sense, right? Because like even I don't know, like even if in mathematics, if you don't have the skills to learn new concepts, then you wouldn't be able to learn the new concepts, right? Like there's like certain things that build off of other things or
Yeah.
other concepts. Is that kind of like how
Yeah, that's
he's treating
certainly,
it?
yeah. That's definitely part of it. And the things that you would build off of in some cases, you can only get through experience or sensory perception in Aristotle's mind.
Okay, that makes sense. All right. And then I guess like how does this sort of form of education apply to the cultivation of moral and intellectual value? Because it seems that Aristotle had a very, very, I guess like he had very deep research into that sort of domain. So how
Mhm.
does kind of this education apply to that?
How does sorry, what's the question?
So how does this like form of education apply to the cultivation of moral and
Hmm.
intellectual virtue?
Oh, okay. So as I read him, Aristotle has this two-part structure to moral education. Habituation is largely targeting the cultivation of moral virtue, things like generosity, temperance, courage, justice, the sort of traits of character that we consider to be virtues. And teaching really aims at cultivating the intellectual virtues, things like Sophia or phronesis, practical wisdom. And so I think that there's some connection between the two, obviously, because something like practical wisdom is kind of the marriage between good judgment and moral character. So there's going to be some sort of connection, some sort of story to tell about how habituation and teaching work together to cultivate that particular intellectual virtue. But for the most part, like broadly speaking, I think it's safe to say, or at least I say in my dissertation, that habituation is aiming at the virtues of character, the moral virtues, and teaching is what's trying to take care of the intellectual virtues. And so far as I've seen, there hasn't been anything in scholarship that sort of fills out the story about intellectual virtue and how it's cultivated.
Interesting. That makes sense. I guess I want to expand a little bit more on what it means to have like moral virtue. Like how does necessarily habituation lead to moral virtue?
So Aristotle thinks that we're all born with the capacity to develop virtues of character. Uh, in some cases, if you're lucky, he thinks you can be born with a kind of natural virtue. But at the very least, all of us are born with a capacity to acquire virtues of character. And it's habituation, this sort of moral training that actualizes that capacity. And so we're all born with a capacity to behave justly, temperately, courageously, etc. But it's only by, in his mind, it's just sort of like a brute fact about our nature as humans, that it's only by engaging in acts that are those things that we end up coming to have them as a kind of second nature.
Okay, got it. You mentioned that there's like an objection to this theory of education, given that it could deprive students of their autonomy.
Yeah.
What is that objection, and how does your research provide a response to that?
So I think that the way that this objection often goes is to first assume that the goal of education is the development of the moral learner's autonomy, where autonomy is meant to convey something like the ability to have genuine access to alternative conceptions of what would be a good life, right? And so if you think that that is the goal of moral education, something like Aristotle's theory would seem to foreclose a lot of those options for somebody and say, no, this is what it means to be courageous or just or temperate or to live well, right? And so it would seem to violate the moral learner's autonomy by giving them a very sort of specific or narrow conception of what counts as a good life, and training them in many cases before they're able to think critically about what they're being taught to behave in certain ways. So it would seem to sort of foreclose these options, or to violate what's sometimes called the child's right to an open future, the ability to determine for themselves how they want to live. So I think that that would be fair enough, like that objection would be fair enough if a couple of conditions were met. First of all, there's the assumption that this is the goal of moral education, that it is to, cultivate a student's autonomy. That's not Aristotle's conception of the goal of moral education. For him, it really is just to take what is wholly good, he says, or something like truly or universally or objectively good, and make that what seems to be good to the individual. But that's sort of completely antithetical to this idea of autonomy as the goal of moral education. So in some ways, they're talking past each other. Somebody who is objecting to Aristotle's view is sort of talking past him. But also, it's the case that that there's not just this habituation process that's part of Aristotle's theory of moral education. And what my dissertation shows is that there's an additional kind of method of education that hasn't really been talked about, namely this style of teaching, which can help overcome, I think, this objection as well. So if it were just the case that habituation, this sort of mostly mindless process of conditioning to behave in certain ways, if that were the sum total of Aristotle's theory of moral education, then there might be this, then this objection might apply. However, teaching is this other part of Aristotle's theory of moral education, I argue, which furnishes the moral learner with the ability to give a well-reasoned justification for certain types of moral behavior that they genuinely believe to be the case. They can articulate the reasons for their actions. And this is also another way to construe the meaning of autonomy. And this is another one of the assumptions that people who make this objection often hold, that there's just one way to cash out the meaning of autonomy, but it turns out there's not. Genuine access to alternative conceptions of the good is one option, but another could be just an appropriate responsiveness to reasons, or another could be the ability to articulate the reasons for one's sincerely held beliefs. And teaching helps satisfy at least that last one.
Okay, got it. That makes sense. I guess to an extent, I guess like it makes sense in theory for why this objection is there. I'm confused in why analyzing the end point of moral education, which you're talking about, how like there's two ships sailing in the dark or something like that. Like, why is that necessarily key to kind of target or respond to this refutation? Because it still seems that it's still like this refutation still stands in a way that like even though like maybe that's not the end goal per se, but the kind of praxis that Aristotle is creating, or at least having for education or like teaching, seems that it falls through that trap, right? Like how do you like get away from that?
So I think that's why it's important to mention the sort of three assumptions that are being made. So first, there's the assumption that Aristotle's playing this game of having this be the end goal of moral education and trying to show how his own methods don't satisfy this stated aim. And what I point out is that, in fact, Aristotle just doesn't share that same concern as people who are making this objection. Be that as it may, like, let's just put that to the side for a second. People who make this claim that Aristotle's form of education is going to render moral learners heteronymous still doesn't quite fly, because one, it's not just habituation that's part of Aristotle's theory of moral education, and two, the conception of autonomy that people are relying on in order to make this kind of objection isn't proven to be the only type of autonomy that we care about. So teaching can actually help you get more autonomous if you consider autonomy to consist in the ability to give or to articulate reasons for your beliefs or your actions. And that's what I argue teaching can do for moral learners in Aristotle's system.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess like this kind of expands into a question now of how like the field of Aristotelian education is like expanding. What are some new research things that like these neo-Aristotelian educators are kind of exploring? And would you classify yourself as one of those? Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. So I was actually just at a conference of the Association for Moral Education in England. And it seemed to me that sort of the hot topic at that conference, at least among some of the higher education institutions that are considered leaders in this field, have to do with studies about how using moral exemplars can help students develop excellent character. So there's this idea in Aristotle that if you want to know what's good or right or just or the right way to behave, it's to look to the person who has practical wisdom, to see somebody who has embodied these virtues of character and of intellect and is actually living in the world and able to enact virtue in this way. So there's been this method of moral education for thousands of years, actually, which involves looking to the people that you admire for their character or for their conduct, and trying to emulate their behavior. And so the researchers that I met at this conference were trying to think about ways to build that into a university curriculum, and in doing so, help moral learners think about ways to critically engage with these moral exemplars in such a way that they could improve themselves and their character in the process.
So what would that look like? What would a curriculum that includes that look like?
Yeah, so it depends on what field you're in, I suppose. It would involve, well, I mean, I know of one educator who uses this in their first year seminar, and that's a class just about character education. And the sort of moral exemplar that he asks students to sort of critically engage with, if I remember correctly, is just like anybody in their lives that they admire. And admiration is a kind of radar detection process that you can use to see what sorts of people and what sorts of character traits you admire in others. And then that can sort of be a clue as to where you think you want your character education development process to go. And so what you could do is write a bit of an essay talking about this person and their character traits that you admire, and also critically reflecting on the parts of their character that you might not want to adopt wholeheartedly, right? There's a danger of just sort of becoming too enamored with somebody, warts and all. And so you can actually critically engage with the sorts of moral exemplars that you admire, and really think carefully about what sorts of things you want to adopt and bring into your own life. And then you can engage in a process of actually imitating what they do in some ways. Like I think we do this a lot of the time naturally, just as human beings. We imitate other people kind of somewhat unconsciously. And so by reflecting on this and doing it intentionally, you can actually, I think, use this as a tool for your own improvement by sort of taking on and emulating the character traits that you would want to see in your own character.
So I guess in these classes, because I know like philosophy as a field, there's a lot of reflection in philosophy, but this seems like way more self-reflection
Yeah.
than maybe like studying ancient philosophy and like just reading text or something like that. And I guess I wanted to ask like in specific fields, and maybe you can talk about how you're maybe trying to do this at Harvard or with like the embedded ethics program and like what it means to bring ethics education into CS curriculums. But like, and I don't know if exactly if you brought like moral exemplars yet, but like just in general, like what would that look like in fields of STEM or in fields of areas where maybe self-reflection isn't the highest priority, right? Because like a lot of fields you want to study the math or study like the science behind a specific field. And so looking at like a specific figure, like let's say I'm looking at Einstein or something like that, like replicating Einstein 100% isn't going to lead to like me just understanding like his theory automatically. Like I'm gonna have to still do a lot more like research and stuff like that. So what exactly are the steps to include this in a STEM research or in a STEM education?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and that's in fact one of the pieces of pushback that we often get in terms of, designing ethics interventions into like a CS curriculum. There's just so much theory that I need to cover in my classes. How can I fit in lessons about ethics? About Einstein in particular, I would say that, emulating the parts of his character that you take to be admirable might not help you understand his, theory of general relativity or whatever, but it might help you be a better physicist, right? If part of what made him such a great physicist was, say, his, I don't know, his endurance or his perseverance in tackling a problem, and you recognized that and tried to emulate it, you might not understand his theory better, but you might be a better physicist in the process by taking on some of these character traits. And I guess it matters, if you're an educator in the STEM field, what you want your students to do. Do you want them to just understand the theory, or do you want them to actually become good theorists or good physicists? And I think that the cultivation of some of these traits of character can actually help with that.
So in these scenarios, because I mean, I think like this is fantastic because I don't think a lot of educators actually tell you or like at least spend time to like identify someone you almost treat as like a role model and then trying to strive basically to extract the good qualities out of that role model and bring them into your life.
Right.
But I'm curious on, because it's like very, very subjective on what it means to be a role model for someone else. How does how do you bring about it in education? Like, is it, you were giving the example that you had in the past, but like, how does one kind of do that self-reflection? How do you engage that self-reflection or lead a student to have that sort of self-reflection? Because it seems almost that like for example, if I like in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. like wake up and I'm like, oh, I really want to be like Einstein. Like his work ethic was insane. Like it's not just going to work automatically, but I want to know like what exactly is the job of the educator to facilitate that self-reflection?
Well, that's a great question. So I'm speaking a little bit outside my depth because I haven't actually done this kind of practice in my own courses yet, but it's something I'm thinking about. So it's good to engage with this. So I think that the first step, insofar as I've seen it explained at conferences, et cetera, is, well, acknowledge, yes, you're right, it is subjective, but it's about your own life. So I think that being subjective in this case is okay. So first you see what sorts of character traits or what sorts of people you genuinely admire. What sorts of things stand out to you as worthy of your admiration? And this is a kind of feeling that you have subjectively, but it's a kind of aspiration too. Like, oh, if I could be like that, then I think this would be good for me. This would be good for my personal growth. So you can start there and just start by reflecting consciously on what sorts of things you find yourself admiring. Writing can help with that, and that's something that an educator can at least give space for in a class. Like maybe it's a reflection assignment where you just have to write out a description of somebody who you take to be a role model, and what traits about them specifically you take to be worthy of emulation. So that could be one step in the process. And then if I were designing an assignment around this, I would probably also give time for maybe 2 weeks, depending on the length of the semester, time to actually engage in trying to emulate those character traits that you think are admirable, and maybe writing a journal reflection on how that's going, just noticing how it's going in your life, being aware of the ways in which these character traits are changing the way you interact with other people, changing the way you feel about yourself, changing the way that you engage in your work, just a sort of process of noticing. And then at the end, I'd probably ask some questions for reflection about the process as a whole. And seeing, asking you, inviting you to think about whether you were right, whether your hypothesis that emulating these sorts of character traits would be good for you was accurate or not. And also you talk about Einstein's insane work ethic, maybe asking some more critical questions about like whether that's really part of what's going to count as a good life for you, is working these insane hours. And just in terms of grading, yeah, I admit it's hard to grade for these sorts of things because it is so much about reflection. But you can grade for completion, for one, but also for critical engagement, especially if you're teaching some techniques in the class that the students have to sort of be able to demonstrate that they're able to do in the assignment as well. Things like writing clearly, engaging with exemplars, and then critically analyzing some of those character traits as well.
That's really interesting. Honestly, I kind of wish that existed at a high school level. I feel like the earlier you kind of start in this reflection, it's easier, especially with how many students are kind of confused on where they want to go in their life, especially when applying for college. So I just think like maybe extracting those qualities at an earlier age would be good. So really hope that like, your seminars and talks on like moral education can kind of bring this this change in education. Hopefully that exists. But I kind of want to ask you now about what you have personally been doing in bringing about ethics education into CS. So what have you been doing at Harvard?
Okay, so at Harvard, what I do is I help run something that's called the Teaching Lab. And that's a seminar that meets once a week with philosophers and computer scientists, and one faculty member at Harvard as well in the philosophy department. And automation. Anyway, we work together. We sort of brainstorm individual lesson plans for specific computer science courses that try to tie some ethical content very tightly together with the technical content that's in that specific course. And so we do that. We embed some ethics into individual computer science courses, and then we distribute those lessons throughout the computer science curriculum. And the hope is that students get these sorts of ethics interventions multiple times throughout their CS degree. And then in doing so, they develop a kind of intellectual habit of thinking about the ethics of the work that they're doing. And it's super important, I think, because unlike in law, where you have a bar exam and you can be disbarred, and if you're practicing law unethically, or bioethics boards or medical ethics boards in hospitals for doctors, there's not much really like that. In fact, I don't think there's anything like that in computer science. And yet the computer scientists and the engineers who are coming out of these degrees are able to do so much with their technical knowledge. They're able to have such impact on people that I think it's really important to have some sort of guardrail in place such that they're able to make sure that they're thinking about the ethics of what they're doing, because so much of what they're doing is already value laden. Like you think about just a data scientist having access to so much data, there's all kinds of privacy issues, also issues about fairness and bias that are going into that data. And it's important to have people who are in those technical positions be able to think about the ethics of what they're doing, because so much of the time government regulations aren't able to keep up with technological innovation. And even if they can keep up, you need to have somebody who can think really, can understand some of the technical content that is being worked on. And it's oftentimes just the computer scientists themselves that can do that. And so I think they need to be equipped with ethics as well.
Yeah, definitely. And so just to clarify real quickly, when you're talking about like embedding these ethics, you're talking about like ethics of AI, ethics of different computer science structures, data structures, big data, ethics of even tech companies overall. Is it all of those?
Yeah, it's really, I wouldn't say it's ethics of tech companies in particular. It's we've run modules in classes on artificial intelligence, on machine learning, on programming languages, on the introduction to computer science, on computer visualization, or computer vision, and everything in between. So we have about 12 to 14 modules a semester, and that covers, I'd say, about 2/3 of the classes that are taught in the computer science department per semester. And so what we always try to do is find some way to tie the ethical content that we're teaching about directly into the technical material that the class is about, so that students see right then and there when they're covering a piece of tech, that there are ethical implications tied right to the thing that they're doing. And it's not just some abstract thing that's kind of over there somewhere, or that somebody else can worry about, that right there when they're learning about facial recognition software, for example, that there are ethical issues involved, even right there and then.
And so is this for like undergraduates, or is this like, are these your required courses as well, or like what is it? Like what's the scope of this?
It's primarily for undergraduates, although we have taught some modules in graduate level courses. And the upper level undergraduate courses are available for graduate students to take as well. So we often get a handful of them in those courses that we teach. But yeah, primarily for undergrads. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I think like to an extent, I think I had a conversation with Dr. Tristan Goetz, Goetze, I forgot the exact pronunciation.
Yes.
But they were, yeah, they were also talking about like the ethics of like big tech companies. Because when I was like kind of in that conversation, I was kind of thinking about how like even learning about this ethics is like great, but when you kind of get employed at a company, unless you're kind of at the top, you're not really at a position to make decisions that are like very like big and like will affect a lot of things. So I guess like to an extent, maybe also kind of exploring that realm. But I think that like this is definitely like a great start in terms of like embedding ethics, because like there's a lot of fields in which as you mentioned, that there's repercussions for not having proper guidelines, ethical guidelines. And computer science isn't one of those fields because of how rapidly it's expanding. So I definitely think that's really interesting and necessary to explore. I want to ask kind of how students and maybe young listeners right now can use Aristotelian education to their benefit, and why it may be necessary to learn about that, or at least kind of conceptualize why those steps of habituation, or like kind of learning about like intellectual virtue, how can that be necessary or beneficial for students?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Well, I think that Aristotelian education in general, it may not be necessary for students to learn about it, but I think it's certainly going to be beneficial to consider, questions about how to develop their own character. And one of the things I like about virtue ethics, which Aristotelian education, or neo-Aristotelian education, is often called like applied virtue ethics. One of the reasons I think that it is crucial, and perhaps even necessary, to study is that the sorts of questions that it asks and tries to answer, questions like, what does it mean to be a good person? Or what is the nature of a good life? How do you live well? These are questions that no matter who you are, you're going to answer some way or another, just by being a certain sort of person and just by living, right? And so virtue ethics, which takes those questions as central and applied, and Aristotelian education, which tries to engage people with these questions, it can help you be intentional about answering those questions. Right? It can give you some tools to think about, well, what sort of person do I want to be, or what sort of life is the right one to live? So yeah, I think in some ways it is necessary, because no matter what, you are going to end up answering those questions in your life at some point somehow. And Aristotelian education can at least be an interesting interlocutor in trying to figure out an answer to those questions for yourself, and maybe even give you some tools to answer them for yourself as well.
Like that's really beneficial, at least exploring like a role model, because like that's not really explored at a high school level. And there's a lot of reflection and self-reflection there that can be really, really interesting.
Mhm.
And I wanted to ask you now, because there might be people who might be interested in following up on your research. What are you doing now, and what are some of your goals and focuses for the coming school year, and also, I guess.
So my research now is concentrating on publishing stuff from my dissertation, but also I'm interested in sort of transitioning into finding ways in which my two loves, which are ancient philosophies generally, but Aristotelian education more specifically, and the ethics of emerging technologies can be merged. So I've got one paper right now underway, which is talking about a class that I taught at Wake Forest University, which was where I tried to apply some of these character education methods to a computer science course. I talk about some results from there. And then I'm also thinking about developing a paper which is a kind of way in which debates about biomedical enhancements often appropriate Aristotle inappropriately, and trying to see whether Aristotle can actually provide a sort of third position within this debate, which could be worthwhile. So, trying to think of ways in which I can make Aristotle and Aristotelian education more relevant for the ethics of emerging technologies and computer science.
Awesome. I will leave a link to your website in the description, so if anyone wants to check that out, they definitely can. That about wraps up our discussion today. Thanks so much for your time. And I learned a lot about Aristotelian education, as you could probably tell with the questions that I bombarded you with, but I'm sure our audience definitely learned as well. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.